Today we are taking a look at TanStack Form, which is TanStack's library for managing forms. So TanStack Form provides a powerful and flexible approach to form management. It is completely type safe, and you can use it with any component library, and you can also use it with any framework. So it is pretty flexible. In fact, if you take a look here at the documentation, it does not only support React, but you're going to find a lot of frameworks that it supports here. In this video, we're going to use React because this is probably what most of you are familiar with. However, you can use it with any of these libraries as well. So TanStack Form provides us with APIs to do things like maybe validation, error handling, and so on. However, these APIs are pretty flexible. So we can, for example, choose when exactly to do validation, maybe on submit, on change, on blur, and so on. And we also have the flexibility to display our UI components, our inputs, and so on using these APIs. So let's take a look at a very quick example here before diving deeper into TanStack Form. So for example, in here we have a form. We define a form using this useForm hook. We have our default values and we have an onSubmit callback. And when we display our form, we simply use some components inside of this form that we create here. And in these components, we define how to validate this form and so on. So for example, in here, we have our form and we have a field here. And in this field, we have a validators object where we do our validations. We can do our validations on change. We can also do it on submit, on blur, and so on. We can also do async validation as well. We're going to take a look at that in details. But this is just a quick overview. And then in the children for this component, we display our UI. So in here, for example, we display an input, a label, and so on. But of course, this can be an input from a component library. If you're using some sort of a component library, and we can get everything related to our field using this field that we get here in this function. And we're going to have our value for the field. We're going to have callbacks that we need to pass to onBlur and onChange. We're going to have information related to errors so that we can display errors and so on. But when you look at this, you might think this is maybe too much code to write for a very simple form. However, at the end of the video, we're going to see a way that TanStack Form provides in order to avoid writing a lot of boilerplate and make our forms very easy to use and very composable as well. So let's get started with TanStack Form. So in here, I have a React project opened and it is just created with Vite and it has shadcn installed as well. So you can clone the repository that I'm going to provide if you would like to follow along, or maybe you have your own React project that you need to work with. It doesn't matter. If you would like to also do this from scratch, in here you can find instructions in shadcn website for how to create a React project with Vite and shadcn as well. This is pretty much what I did to create this project. And you also don't have to use shadcn. I'm just using shadcn because later we're going to see how to integrate component libraries like this with TanStack Form. But maybe you are using any other component library. This is also going to work. But in here, I have this app component, which is displayed in our homepage like so. So let's get started in this component. So let's first install TanStack Form. So we need to install a few packages. So first of all, TanStack Form itself, which is npm install TanStack or at TanStack React Form. Or of course, you might be using something else other than npm. I'm using npm, so I'm going to install that. And also, TanStack Form provides us with some dev tools that we can use in order to debug our form and so on. So we can install that as well by installing TanStack React DevTools. And in addition to that, we also need to install TanStack React Form DevTools. So after this is done, we can also install TanStack and then React Form DevTools like so. And now in order to use these DevTools, we can go here in our main.tsx file. This can be different for you if you created your own project. However, in here, when we render this app component, we also need to render the TanStack DevTools. So in here, TanStack DevTools, and then we need to posit the form plugin. So in here, in plugins, we need to posit form DevTools plugin from TanStack Form DevTools like so. and we need to call this function. By having this, we should be having this icon here that is going to display these DevTools. But now we can get started and create our first form. So let's say now that we have a register form, for example, that we need to create. So first of all, I'm going to go in here, maybe in this lib folder or so, create a new component. So in here, I'm going to create a component. Let's call it registerForm.tsx. Now, first of all, I'm going to create a TypeScript interface here that is going to contain everything that our form is going to have. So let's assume our form is going to have, we have an interface here, register form. We're going to have first name, last name, age, email, password, confirm password. In addition to that, we're also going to have nested stuff. So we're going to have an address. An address is an object, and inside of it, we have nested fields like street, city, state, and so on. And we also have an array, for example. So we have an array of skills, and this is an array of object where each object in this array contains a name, ID, and a level of experience, beginner, intermediate, expert. And we can have a boolean as well. So we have an accept terms field here. So in here, we have pretty much all possible types that we can have in a form. So this would be a good example. But now let's create our component. So I'm going to create a component here, register form. And from here, we're going to return some markup. So in order to use TanStack Form, first of all, we use the useForm hook. So in here, I'm going to define a new form, and I'm going to import useForm from TanStack Form. And in here, we need to specify our default values. So we can specify default values here. And let's say initially we're going to have an empty form. So in here, I'm going to define this constant default values, which has a type of register form. And then I'm going to just define some empty values in here. So in here, we can just pass this to our useForm hook. You can, however, maybe you have an edit form that will have some fields populated. What you can do is you can populate default values with something that you maybe load from an API or database and so on. You can do that by simply, we have an example here. In your default values, add some data from some state. So in here, for example, we have an example using the useQuery hook from TanStack Query, where we load some data from maybe a database and we get our data and we put our data here in our default values instead of just the empty fields that we have here. And also we only render our form when our loading is done as well. But in our case, let's maybe keep it simple and use our empty form for now. But now that we have this form, we're going to be able to render our fields by using some components inside of this form. So in here, let's first create a form, and we're going to maybe handle submission later, but let's have just a form. And in here, we need to render our fields. So what we can do is we can use form.field. And in here, we will need to give it a name, and this name should be one of our fields. So we're going to have TypeScript completion here and type safety for our possible fields that we specified in our type. In our case, let's say we need to render our first name. As children, or as a child to form.field, we can pass a function, and in this function, we're going to have access to this field object. So we're going to take a look at that in a moment. So in here, we can return something. Let's maybe just return nothing for now. And let's maybe console log this field, see what we're going to have inside of it. And also, while we are here, let's console log our form as well to maybe take a look at what we're going to have in this form. So by saving this, let's inspect here and take a look at our console. And of course, we need in our app.tsx, we need to render our form. So let's import register form from our lib like so. So we have a form API and we have a field API. So of course, form API is coming from here. Field API is coming from here. In the form API, we have some stuff related to the entire form. We're not going to go into details for now, but these are some APIs related to our entire form and not just a specific field. And then in our field API, we have things related to our specific field. So I have things like get value, get meta. We also have the name of our field, as you can see here, first name. We should also have a state here for our field, which is going to contain everything related to our field, errors, the value, if our field is dirty, and so on. We're going to see everything in details. This is just a quick look. But now let's remove these logs. And let's actually use something from our form API that we've seen, which is a function that is going to handle submission. So in here, on submit, we're going to need to pass a function here. And in here, we are going to need to prevent the default submission and let TanStack Form handle the submission by calling a function inside of this form API. So in here, in form, we have handle submit that we can call. This is going to handle submission, validation, and so on. We're going to see more details in a moment. But before submitting our form, just need to mention something quickly here. So when we pass these default values, we can pass them like so, which is fine. However, we can also use a function called form options, where we can define form options that can be shared across multiple forms. So in here, for example, we can have a constant, let's call it form options. In here, we can call a function called form options from TanStack Form. And in here, we can pass some form options like validation, like default values. Let's call this maybe something else. Now by having this, we can maybe export this and use it across multiple forms. How? By just simply in here, instead of defining default values, we can just spread whatever we have in form options like so. And this is going to be exactly the same. So now for this specific form, we can reuse these options, and then we can maybe add specific options for this form as well. So great. So let's now pass the first option that we need to pass, which is onSubmit. This is going to be the function responsible for handling the submission of your form. So when we submit our form, this function is going to run, and we're going to get some stuff in here. Let's maybe call it data, and let's console log it. So let's console log data. And now let's submit our form by maybe in here, just add a quick button here, submit, and give it a type of submit as well. So now we have this submit button. When we click on this, remember, when we submit our form, we are already calling form.handleSubmit, which is going to call this function that we pass here in useForm. So let's click on that, and we're going to get some stuff, including our value, the value for our form. Of course, we did not change anything in our fields, so we get our default values here. So from this function, we can get our value, and maybe we can do something with it, send a request to some API and so on. But now let's finally display our fields. So remember, in here we have this form field, and we were returning just nothing here. Now let's return some input to manipulate our first name. So I'm going first to use just a normal HTML input, and then later we're going to use components from shadcn as well. But let's for now just add some wrapper div here with some margin bottom. And now let's add our input. In our input, we're going to need to pass some stuff from this field that we get here. First of all, I'm just going to add some styling. So it is going to look like so. Also, let's just make it, let's add some classes to this div so that it looks a little bit smaller. So here it is. So what do we need to do here? We need to pass the value for our field, which we can get from our field. And then inside of state, we get our value. And now we need, whenever we update our input, to update the value of this field. And we can do that by passing an onChange function here. And onChange, we need to get our value, which we can get from our event, and then call a function that exists also in our field, which is handleChange. So handleChange, and we need to pass it the value, which is event.target.value. Finally, we also need to add an onBlur function and call a function from our field that is going to handle blur, because on blur we can do some validation as well. So we need TanStack Form to handle that. So we need to call a function from field, which is handle blur, like so. And this should be pretty much everything that we need to pass to our input from our field that we get here. Let's also just maybe add a placeholder here, first name. And now let's maybe give it a refresh. And now when we type something here, this should update our form. How can we know? Of course, we can confirm by maybe taking a look at our console logs. and click on submit. And now in our, remember in here, we are logging our value for our form. Now in here, we get the value for our first name that we typed. We can also use these dev tools. However, as I'm recording this, these dev tools are a little bit buggy. So sometimes it might not show the form here. But anyways, we have, we can click on TanStack Form. You should have a form here. And in here, you will have information about your form. And as you can see, we have the value for our first name. And we also have some meta information. It's going to contain information about our fields, if it has errors and so on. And this is what we are going to discuss next. Let's now take a look at these meta information that we get for each field and what they mean exactly. So we can use the dev tools. However, for me, when I have the dev tools opened and I change something, the field becomes a little bit laggy. So I'm not going to use these for now. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to display the meta information in our markup by going in here. And maybe when we display our input for our field, let's also display the meta information for this field by maybe going here and displaying this using JSON.stringify. So JSON.stringify and then pass our field. This is, field. This is going to live in state and then meta. And in order to make this look pretty, we need to pass null here and 2 for the tab width. And also we need to wrap this in a pre-tag like so. By having this, we're going to have the information for this field in here. But now let's give it a refresh, start from scratch. And let's discuss some of these and what they mean. Of course, you might already be familiar with these terms. So isTouched, for example, is going to be false initially until we either change our value or just focus on our value and blur. So if we go in here, change something, as you can see, isTouched is now true. However, let's refresh. If we just focus and blur, isTouched is also going to be true even if we did not change the value. And then we also have isBlurred, which is pretty self-explanatory. If we blur, if we were focused on the field and then blur, this is going to be true. And then we have isDirty, which is going to be true only when we change the value of the field. So if we do some changes here, isDirty is going to be true, even if we reverted our value back to the original or the default value. isDirty is still going to remain true since it was changed at least once, even if the value for it now is the default value. It's going to remain dirty. isPristine is the opposite of isDirty. Initially is going to be true. Once we change something in our field, it is going to be false. We're going to skip isValid for now. This is related to validation, which we're going to discuss later. However, isDefaultValue, this can be used if you need to check that the value of the field is currently the default value, even if it was touched before. So even if the value is dirty, but it has the default value, this is going to be true. So we can do something here. Now it is false. However, unlike isDirty, if we revert back our field to the default value, this is going to be now true. And this is how we can know if our value is the default value. We should rely on this and not on isDirty. So that's it for now. The rest of the meta information we're going to take a look at later. However, what we can do now is, in addition to having these information on the field level, so remember, currently we are displaying this in the field for our first name, but we can also access the same information in the form level as well. So in this form object, we also have some information. So let's maybe add another pre-tag here. However, this one, let's add it before the form. And it displays form.state. If we save this, as you can see, we get a lot of stuff here. So it ends here and it starts from here, including the values. And also we have meta information for each field. So we have our meta information for first name, and we have the same stuff that we have on the field level. However, let's try to change something here. So now isDirty, for example, is supposed to be true. However, if we take a look at it here, maybe I guess we just need to refresh. So initially, isDirty, for example, is false here. And in the form level, field meta is not going to contain anything initially. But now if we change something here, isDirty is true. and field meta is still an empty object. It did not update when we change something in our field. And this is because by default, TanStack Form is going to avoid unnecessary re-renders to your form component when something in your form changes. So if you need to depend on something in this form object here, you need to somehow subscribe to it, which is our next topic. Let's now say we need to use something from this form object that we are logging here. Maybe let's say we need to use some of the values somewhere. Maybe we need to use is dirty, for example, and so on. So let's maybe in here, instead of printing this whole object, let's maybe print just a couple of stuff. So inside of a p tag here, I'm going to do form, and then I'm going to access the state, and then let's say we need to get one of the values, and let's say we need to display the first name, for example. Let's also maybe put another one to display if the form is dirty or not. So I'm going to check form.state.isDirty, and I'm going to display dirty or pristine based on this. So by the way, this is dirty on the form is going to be true if any of the fields are dirty. However, of course, we have another is dirty inside of the field itself, and this is going to be specific for a specific field. But anyways, if we save this now, we're going to get nothing here for the first name, and we're going to get pristine. But as we change, nothing is going to be updated here in the form level, because as we've mentioned, TanStack Form is going to avoid unnecessary re-renders when something changes in the form, and therefore we need to subscribe to certain things in the form in order to get their updated values when they change. So in our case, we need to subscribe to first name, for example, and is dirty. So how can we do that? We can do that in a couple of ways. The first way is that we can use the useStore hook. So in here, we have a hook called useStore. So let's say, let's create a constant here. Let's say first name. And in order to get updates for first name, we can use this useStore hook that we can import from TanStack React Form. In here, we pass it form.store, and then we have a second argument that we should pass in order to get specific things from the form. We don't have to pass it, by the way, but it is recommended to pass it so that we can avoid this value being updated every time anything in the form changes, which is probably not what you need. So let's maybe call this store here. And let's just maybe display it the same way we did before, like so, store. Now we're going to have this, but this time, every time we update something, this entire store is going to update. As you can see, we have our first name, and now in our field meta, we have first name and we have our is dirty set to true. Also, the is dirty on the form level is set to true as well, and so on. However, we don't need to subscribe to this entire object. This is probably inefficient. We only need specific values. So how can we specify values to subscribe to? We pass a second argument here. So let's get this back to username. And if we need to get, the first name. If we need to only subscribe to the first name, we pass a function here where we're going to get our state. And we just return the things that we need. So state.values.firstname. And now we can maybe duplicate this and do the same for is dirty and subscribe to, I think it would be in state.isDirty, like so. And now let's maybe remove this object and display these values, first name and is dirty, like so. Now if we save this, do something, we're going to get updates here. So this is how we can subscribe to something in our form object in the most efficient way to avoid unnecessary re-renders. But in addition to useStore, we also have another way to subscribe to some value, and this is using the form.subscribe component. And this is better if we would like to react to some change in our form in our UI for the component. So let's say in our markup for our form, we need to maybe show or hide some stuff based on some value in our form. This way we can use a component called form.subscribe. So inside of form, we have a subscribe component. In here, we can pass it a selector prop, and in here we can pass a function that is going to receive our state, and then we can return the value that we need to subscribe to. So let's say in here we need to subscribe to first name, for example. So state.values.firstname. And let's say we need if we have a first name, we need to display a field for the last name. Otherwise, we need to hide the field for the last name. So in addition to selector, we can also pass children. We can pass it like so as a prop, or we can just pass it in here. And in our children function, we are going to get the value that we subscribe to, which is first name. And we can return something from here. So in here, we need to check, let's say in here, we need to check if we have a first name, we need to display the field for the last name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check for first name and then display the field for last name, which is going to be exactly similar to this one. So I'm not going to type everything from scratch. I'm just going to paste some stuff in here. So in here, we have the markup for the last name, exactly similar to the first name. We are passing the name of the field here, and then in here, we're passing the input. We're forwarding our own change, on blur, the value, and so on. Exactly similar to what we've done for first name. So now, as you can see, we have this field here. However, if we remove our first name, this is going to hide. Because in here, we are subscribing to changes in first name. And based on our first name, we are choosing to display this field or not. If we type again, it should appear again here. Let's also, by the way, remove this object. This object is the meta information for this first name field. We don't need it for now. Maybe let's comment it for now. And why don't we do something? So in here, let's, instead of maybe subscribing to first name only and is dirty, let's subscribe to all of our values for our form. So in here, I'm going to subscribe to state.values. And maybe let's remove is dirty. This was just for testing. And down here, I'm going to remove this is dirty from here. And let's, instead of first name, display all the values for our form. So in here, we have all of our values. And if we type something, this should update. But now, let's say we typed a first name. We have our last name field appearing here. And let's say we typed something, everything is updating. But now let's say we removed our first name again. Our last name is going to remain. However, let's assume if we clear our first name, we need to also clear our last name as well. How can we do that in TanStack Form? What we can do is we can use listeners. So for any form, for any field, we have listeners where we can listen for changes in our field and maybe do something whenever the field changes. So in any field, in our case, we need to listen for changes in the first name. So we can pass listeners here. And we need to listen for changes on change. We can also, we need to pass an object here. We can pass here on change, on blur, probably on submit as well, and so on. However, let's say whenever we change something in our field, we need to do something which is clearing the last name. So inside of here, we are going to pass a function. In this function, we're going to have access to the value of the first name field. So we can destructure value from here. And what we can simply do, we can check if we don't have a value. So if we cleared our first name, we need to do something which is clearing our last name. How can we clear our last name? In our form, we have access to this function setFieldValue, where we can set a value for a specific field. In our case, we need to set last name and set it to an empty string. If we save this, type something in our first name, something in our last name, and then clear our first name, our last name should be cleared as well. So unlike form.subscribe, where we change something in our UI based on the value of some field that we have or some state, we can use listeners in order to do something programmatic when the value of some field changes as well. We can also debounce this function as well. So in here we have debouncing options. So we have onChange debounce and unblur debounce. And this can be useful if we maybe in this onChange function send a network request or something. Of course, it wouldn't be efficient to send a request every time we change, every time we type something in our input. In this case, we can use this debounce option, where we can have onChange debounce and set it to maybe 500 milliseconds or so that this function will only run if we stop typing for 500 milliseconds or any time that we pass here. One last thing I would like to mention regarding listeners is that in addition to having them in the field level, we can also have listeners on the form level as well. So in our, in our useForm hook, we can also have listeners And in here, this is going to run whenever anything in our form changes. So we can in here pass on change as well, for example. And in here, in this function, we are going to have a couple of stuff. We're going to have the form API. We're also going to have the field API of the field that was changed. So if we try to maybe console log these, in here, let's maybe open our console and let's try to change something. So change something in our first name. We get the form API, which contains the stuff for our form, but also we get the field API for the value that was changed, which is first name. If we change this clear, if we change last name, for example, we get the same. However, field API this time is going to be the last name field. So far, we've seen how to add inputs in order to change our fields. However, we tried to change our first name and last name. But what about changing fields that are nested? So if we would like to change the street inside of address, how would we do that in TanStack Form? And it's actually very simple. So let's go down here in our form. Let's say after our last name, which is inside of subscribe here. Let's put a new field. And what we simply need to do is when we specify our name for our field, so form.field. In here, when we put our name, we just put our nested object or our nested item in the object using dots. And we actually get autocomplete here. So you get an idea of how it is done. So if we'd like to change the street, for example, we do address.street. And then inside of here, it is just exactly similar to what we've done before. So we have a function where we get our field. And in here, we can return our field. I'm just going to paste this markup. It is going to be exactly similar to what we've done before. So now we have the street input. And if we change it, it is going to change the street that is nested inside of address. But what about arrays? So in here, we have this skills array. And let's say we need to be able to add items to this array, remove items, change stuff inside of the items in the array. So this is, remember, an array of skills, and each skill is going to contain name, ID, and a level. Let's say we'd like to change the level for a skill inside of our array. How can we handle that in TanStack Form? First of all, I am going to put some dummy skills initially in our default values. So in here, I'm going to put like so, an array of dummy skills. So just a name, random ID, and a level. And what we need to do first is just display our skills. So in here, let's go after our field that we just added, the street one. And let's put a new field, so form.field. And this one is going to be for our skills. However, we need to do something else here. So in addition to name of skills, we also need to add a mode of array, right? And now inside of here, we are normally going to get a function with our field, like so. And in here, we can return our markup. In our markup, let's maybe just wrap everything with a div. And let's maybe add some text of skills. And then maybe inside of another div, let's do a loop to loop through our existing skills. So this is going to be found in field.state.value. And this is going to be an array that we can map through. And for each item, let's call it skill. And we're also going to have our index. And then we can return something for each skill. So in here, let's also maybe do a div. And inside of here, let's display our skill.name. And let's also add a dash here and display the skill.level as well. If we save this, we're going to get, let's maybe give it a refresh. Let's also maybe, hide this, or maybe let's put this object that we are logging below our form. We're going to need to take a look at it, but let's maybe just put it down here. So now we should have our skills, and we have our list of skills here, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and so on. And what we need to do next is we need to be able to add new skills, remove skills, and also change the skill level as well. I'm just going to quickly make things a little bit clear. Let's give some styles to this submit button. And also let's, for this pre-tag, add some space here. And, margin top. And I'm just going to keep it. We're going to need to take a look at it later. But for now, let's handle removing skills and adding skills as well. And this is actually made very simple by TanStack Form. TanStack Form is going to provide us with some functions that's going to make adding and removing pretty easy. So in here, for each skill, let's say we need to add a remove button. So maybe in here, of course, I'm not giving too much attention to our markup and styling and so on. We just need to focus on the concepts. So let's add a quick button here. Button like so. And let's say maybe, let's add an X here. And I'm going to give it some styles. So we're going to have this button. And now let's do something on click. And on click, we need to remove the skill. So how can we do that? In TanStack Form, we get inside of our field, we get a function here to remove items from this array. So we have remove value. And then in here, we just posit the index of the value that we need to remove. Of course, we get the index here from our map function. And that's pretty much it. If we now click on this, we're going to remove our skills. And of course, as you can see, this reflects here as well. So now we have an empty array. Let's refresh and let's add another button to add elements to this array, which is also pretty simple. So let's maybe go in here after our loop, maybe after this div, let's add a button to add a new skill. So I'm going to add a button. Let's add some text, add skill. In here, I'm going to add some styling. So we have this button here, and then on click, let's add a new skill. Of course, I'm going to just add some dummy skill here. This can be, of course, in reality, something integrated with some backend that you have, stuff like that, but I'm just going to add some dummy skill. So to add something to our array, we call field.pushValue, and we just simply pass a new value. So in our case, we have an array of objects, so we need to add an object here with our name. For our name, I'm just going to add a new skill, and maybe we can in here check the current length for our field. So field.state.value.length, and then maybe add one to it. Just some random text, and then I'm going to also add a random ID. So we can use crypto.uuid. And finally, I'm going to add a level, let's say beginner. And just by doing that, now if we click on add skill, we're going to get a new skill added here. And of course, it goes without saying, but if we take a look at the value for our skills field now, we should have the new items in our array as well. All right, now let's do one final thing, which is editing the skill level inside of our items, inside of our array. So we need to have fields to manipulate this value, the value that we have inside of our array for our level inside of this object, right? So how can we do that? Let's go back here. Let's maybe clean things up a little bit. So let's open the div that contains our skills. And by the way, in our loop, we need to add a key here. So let's say skill.id. What I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe remove our level from here. We're going to display it in a different way. And let's also wrap this in a span, the skill name. And let's make everything next to each other by adding the class name of flex and items enter. Like so, let's add some margin bottom, and also let's add a gap of 2 as well. Now we have this, and what we need to do now is we need to put a drop down next to the skill, which is going to display the currently selected skill level, and we are going to be able to change it from this drop down as well, right? So notice that we are already inside of a field in here, which is the skills field. And we need to put another field inside of it for the skill level. So we need to have some sort of a subfield inside of the skills field. And we can do that normally by just adding another field inside of this skills field, which remember has a mode of an array. So let's put it after the name here. I guess we will need more space. Let's put another field for the skill level. So in here, form.field. And the name is going to be, let's close this. So the name is going to be, inside of the skills array, we need to target a specific skill, so one of these objects, and then inside one of these objects, we need to access the level. So we're going to need to have some dynamic stuff here, so let's put this in a string template. So, and inside of skills, we need to target the current item in our array, so we have our index. So what we need to achieve eventually is something like this, skills of 0, level, so on. But of course this 0, we don't need to hard code it. We need to depend on this index. So we can just remove this and put our index like so. And let's maybe inside of this field just display our value quickly. In here we're going to, similar to any field, get a function with our field. Let's maybe call it subfield this time, and we can return something. For now, let's maybe just display the subfield dot state dot value. And now if you take a look here, we have our value beginner, and so. But now that we have this as a field, we can now add, of course, instead of just displaying this value, we can add an input, a drop down, to be able to manipulate this value as well. So this is also going to be similar to what we've done with the input, but we're going to just use a drop down instead. So let's do it this time. Let's add a select input, and I'm going to give it just some class names for styling. So it should look like this. And now we need to put our possible options, which are the beginner, intermediate, expert, and so on. So we can do that like so, just putting some option tags here with our values and our text. So now we have that. And finally, we need, similar to what we've done with the other inputs, we need to forward, we need to display our value, of course, and then forward on change and on blur, so that when we change our field, it will actually change in our form. So this is also going to be pretty similar. Let's do it in our select. Here, let's put our value, which is going to be subfield this time, and then .state .value. And similarly, we can do the onBlur, which is going to be inside of subfield .handle blur. And finally on change. In here, we're going to get our event that contains our value, and what we need to do is we need to call subfield and then .handle on change or handle change, and then pass it to the value, which is going to be in event.target .value, like so. And now by doing that, I guess this should be everything. Now, if we change something here, let's change this to expert. This should update our form, and we should see it here. So we have level expert, and of course we can do it to any other field. So here we go, and now we are able to add, remove, and also change something inside of our array of objects in our form. So this is how we can deal with arrays and subfields in TanStack Form. So now we've seen how to handle normal strings, we've seen objects and also arrays. Let's also finally see this boolean that we have here, and how to manipulate this value as well, which is going to actually be very straightforward. So let's do it quickly. So after maybe this long one, this array, let's put a field. I'm going to paste it because it's going to be pretty straightforward, very similar to what we've already done. So I'm going to paste this field, which is going to be responsible for the accept terms item that we have here, which is a boolean. But now when we render our field, I'm going to render a checkbox. So I have an input here with a type of checkbox, and I'm just normally passing the value on blur and on change. Maybe the only difference here is that on change here is going to have the value in event.target.checked and not event.target.value. This is maybe the only difference. And now if we save this, we are going to have a checkbox here. If we check it, it should update our accept terms and set it to true. Uncheck it, it should be false, and so on. But now, of course, I know what you might be thinking. We are having a lot of code here, a lot of boilerplate for a form that is relatively simple. But as we've mentioned before, don't worry. At the end of the video, we're going to discover a way to somehow abstract our form and make it a lot smaller in size. However, for now, let's focus on our next important topic, which is validation. Let's now see how can we validate our fields in TanStack Form. So in TanStack Form, we can either do validation on the field level for each field, or we can also do it on the form level as well. And we're going to see how to do both, but let's maybe first start with the field level. So let's say we need to validate this first name field here. Then what we can do is simply add a validators prop here, and we can validate or we can choose when exactly to perform our validation. So we have on change here, we have on blur, we also have on submit when we submit our form, And also we can do it dynamically using onDynamic, which we are going to discuss later as well. But for now, let's say we need to do our validation on change when we change our field, or as we type in our field. So let's add in change here. And also, validation can either be synchronous or asynchronous. So maybe in some situations, we need, in order to validate our field, we need to maybe send some network request. This is also supported in TanStack Form using onChange async, onBlur async, onSubmit async, and so on. And we're also going to take a look at that later, but for now, let's focus on the basic validation using an onChange function here. So now in this function, we're going to pass, we're going to get an argument here containing our value. So we can destructure our value from here, and we are going to get our value, and we can write some logic here in order to validate this field. So for example, in here, let's say we need our field to be at least 2 characters. So we can check here if our value.length is maybe less than 2. Then we can return something. And if we return something here that is not false, then this is going to be considered an error. So we can simply just return a string with an error message, for example. So I'm going to return this message here. First name must be at least 2 characters. And now if we save this, let's also remember we had in our field, we were displaying the meta information for our field. Let's maybe get this back so that we can see it. And as you can see, for this field, we have errors. We also have error map, an error source map, and so on. And this is going to contain information about our errors. So now that we are doing our validation on change, now as we type here, we should get our error messages if we have any validation errors. In our case, we have 1 character here. So we get in our errors an array with our errors. And this is an array because we can have multiple errors as well. And also we get this error map containing the function that triggered this error, which is in our case onChange, and the error message, because we can also have multiple functions here. We can have validation that happens on change and validations that happen on blur as well. And we're going to get which error happened by which function in this error map here. But now if we continue to type, we don't have errors now, so these errors are going to be gone, right? So now that we have that, why don't we show this error after our field? So after our input, when we display our input here, let's add a condition and check if we have any errors. Let's display it somehow. So in addition to these errors, we also get this isValid property here, which is going to be false if we have any validation errors. So we can check for that here. So let's say if not valid, so if not field.state.meta.isValid, then our form is not valid, we have errors and we need to display them. So let's display some errors here. And our errors is going to live in this errors array in addition to this error map as well. So depending on how you want to display your errors, you can choose one of these. For now, I'm just going to use this errors array. So I'm simply just going to put a div with a red text here. And in here, I'm going to, remember this is an array, so we need to display all of our errors. For now, I'm just simply going to convert this array into a string using joins. So let's get our errors, our errors array like so, and then use join to create a string from our array and use a comma as a separator. So now by having that, we should get our error displayed here. And as we type, our validation is going to happen and our errors are going to show and hide as we type. Of course, we can also change this and make it on blur as well. So that, on blur, so that our validation only runs when we blur the field. So, not in listeners, but in validators here. So also give it a refresh. Now, as we type, nothing is happening. But if we blur our field, and we have an error, we should get our error now. All right. For now, I'm going to maybe keep it as onChange. And now let's do something. I'm going to maybe just comment this for now so that we have our whole form here. And let's say if we have errors in our form, if we have any error, we should maybe disable this submit button. So how can we do that? We need to subscribe to something in our form state. So remember, we can do that either using useStore, or we can do it also using the subscribe component that we actually have used here as well. I'm going to use subscribe because we need to change something in our UI based on whether we can submit our form or not. So in here, let's go to our submit button and down here. And I'm going to maybe just cut it from here for now and then wrap it in this subscribe component. So in here, let's use form.subscribe. And what we need to subscribe to is something in the state of the form, a flag that is called can submit. So as a selector here, I'm going to pass a function. In our function, remember we get the state of our form, and we can subscribe to things, we can subscribe to things in the state of our form. What we need to subscribe to is state.canSubmit. This is going to be false if we have any validation errors. And now in our children, we can pass a function where we are going to have our state that we subscribe to. So let's in here pass function. We're going to have access to canSubmit. And now from this function, we can return our button. So I'm going to paste back my button, but now we have access to canSubmit, and we can disable our button if we cannot submit. So if not canSubmit, we are going to disable the button. Also, to make this visible, I'm going to, if our button is disabled, make maybe the opacity maybe 40 or so. And also let's add, if we are disabled, let's make the cursor not allowed. So let's add here cursor and not allowed as well. So now as you can see, our button is disabled, but if we don't have any errors, our button is going to be enabled again. Great. So one more thing that we can do, as we've mentioned, remember, let's get back our comment for our state for the metadata for our field, our first name field here. And we've seen this error map property that we have here that's going to contain our errors if we have errors. However, unlike this errors property that is just going to be an array of errors, this is going to be a map where we have additional information of how this error happened, whether using the onChange function, onBlur, and so on. So let's give it a quick try here by adding an onBlur function here as well, because we can do validation using multiple functions. We can do validations as we type, and also we can do other validations as we, or when we blur our feed. So we can add an onBlur here as well. And then we're also going to get our value. And let's say, let's do some other validation here. So let's check maybe if our value is maybe not equals to John. Let's return another error, and let's say your name must be John. So now let's maybe give it a refresh as well. So now as we type, the error from onChange is going to happen. However, when we blur, the other error from onBlur is going to run, and we now get two errors. We have our error from onChange and our error from onBlur in this array. However, in addition to that, in this error map, we also get both of our errors, but this time we know that this error happened on blur and this one on change. And maybe you might need to use this information in your UI somehow. For me, I'm not going to use it, but I just wanted to mention that you can also have multiple validations using multiple functions in this validators prop here. As we've mentioned, in addition to doing validations on the field level, we can also do validations on the form level as well. So in here, when we define our form using useForm, we can also add validators here. However, we need to differentiate between two things. We need to differentiate between errors that we're going to return as a general error for the entire form and errors that belong to a specific field. So in here, this is an object, not a function. And in here, we can pass it the same stuff that we can pass in the field level, on change, on blur, and so on. So let's do on change, for example. But now in this function, what we are going to get as a value is the value of the entire form and not a specific field. So let's maybe try to console log this. And this should contain the values for all of our fields. So in here, by the way, also let's remove this object that we are displaying here. And now if we go to our console and maybe change something here, from this console log in our own change validator, which is in line 64 here, we are getting the values for our entire form. So what we can do here is we can check for any field that we need to check for. So let's say, let's also, by the way, just to avoid any confusion, let's for now comment the validators for the field level and only keep the one on the form level. In here, we can check maybe for the first name as well. So value.firstname. And let's just do the same check that we did. If the first name is not John, we're going to return your name must be John. However, let's give it a refresh. And when we return some error in the validators that are defined on the form level, what we're going to return here is going to be a general error for the form. It is not going to be tied to a specific field. So if we type here something that is not John, we're going to get an error for this field because this is not an error for this field. It is a general error for the form. And how we can access this is we can access it in the state of the form itself, which, as we know now, we can subscribe to things in the state of the form using the useStore and also using the form.subscribe. But for this time, let's subscribe to our errors for the form using the useStore hook. In here, we can pass the store form.store, and in the state of the form, we have access to errors. These errors are general errors for the form that we returned from here and not errors related to a specific field. So I'm just going to display these errors just before rendering the form. Since they are not related to a specific field, we can put these errors before the form like so. Now if we take a look, as we type, we're going to get this error, which is a general error for the form and not an error tied to a specific field. However, this does not mean that in this validators object that we define in useForm on the form level, does not mean that we cannot return errors related to specific fields. We can do that as well. So let's maybe remove this check here, and let's say we need to return an error that belongs to the first name that should appear after the first name, since we are, remember, displaying errors here after the input for first name. Let's say we need to populate the errors for this first name. So what we can do is, instead of just returning the error, we can return an object that contains fields. So return, and in here, return an object that contains fields. And in fields, we can then choose a field like first name, for example, and return an error for first name. So maybe just type some random stuff here and save. Now let's give it a refresh. As we type here, we're going to get this error. Now this error is related to first name since we are returning this fields object here. But now we can do actual stuff here. So I'm just going to do a quick one here. Maybe check if not value. Remember, value is the value for our entire form. So if not value.first name, let's return first name is required. Save this, refresh. And now if we, as we type, remove our first name, we should get first name is required. So from here, we can also target specific fields. And now you might be asking, how can we target fields that are nested, like this street field, for example? And quite simply, we can just use dots here again. So address .street, for example. Let's say we need to return an error for this. Now we can just do that. I'm also going to do a quick check here. If we don't have value.address.street, return an error. However, remember that we are only displaying errors for this input, which belongs to the first name field. We need to do the same for the rest of our fields as well. So I'm going to copy this bit of code that displays the error and put it for the street field as well, which is this one. And don't worry, I know this is a bit of a repetition, but later we're going to clean things up and make our form more reusable. But let's put this here for now. And now if we type remove, we should get this error for the street field as well. We can also do it for arrays. So if we go back here in our useForm, validators for our useForm, in our fields, remember we have an array of skills. Each skill is an object that contains the name of the skill, ID, and a level. Let's say we need to return an error for the level input of the first item in our skills array. We can do that by adding in here skills of 0, for example, and then this is an object. We need the level item in this object, and for this level, we can maybe also do a check if our value dot skills of 0 dot level is not expert, for example. Let's return some error as well. So I'm going to return you must be an expert, otherwise just return undefined, which means there are no errors. Again, we are not displaying errors for this dropdown, so let's do it quickly here. Let's copy this bit of code. And remember, this dropdown was in this subfield that we are looping through here. We have our dropdown, so in here, after maybe our select, let's maybe wrap our select in some fragment or so. And then let's put this here. However, remember this should be now subfield and not field, like so. So sorry for, we have a lot of nesting here, but this should work if we change something here and we do not choose experts. We should get this error, you must be an expert as well. So we have both options. We can do our validations on the field level, but we can also do them on the form level as well. But one thing that you should be aware of, if you have both, if you have validations that happen on the form level here, and maybe you return an error for first name, but then in first name itself, you have the validators and you have an error from here as well, this one is going to override the one from the form level. In TanStack Form, we can also have asynchronous validations as well. So maybe most of the time our validations are going to be synchronous. However, sometimes maybe to validate a field, we need to do something asynchronous, like maybe sending a network request. So let's have an example. And by the way, anything that we're going to do here can be done either on the field level and on the form level as well. However, let's stick maybe to the field level, but just keep in mind that anything that we're going to do can be done in the form level as well. So I'm going to uncomment these and let's go to the ones in the validators on the form level, and maybe let's remove these so that we can avoid any confusion. So now we only have validators in the first name field. So any validation function that we pass here to validators, like onChange and onBlur and so on, can also have an async version. So we have onChange async, onBlur async, and so on. And we can have both as well. We can have onChange, for example, where we do some synchronous validation like this one. We can also have at the same time onChange async. So maybe instead of creating a new one, let's change this onBlur to onChange async. And let's say in here, we do something asynchronous. So first of all, let's make this function async. And let's simulate that we're doing something asynchronous here. I'm just going to send a request to this dummy API here and also add some delay just to simulate that this takes some time. So I'm adding a set timeout of 2 seconds here. So now what is going to happen is the onChange one is going to run first. If it failed, if the validation failed here, then we're going to get this error and this one is not going to run in the first place. However, if this one passed, then this one is going to run, the asynchronous one. If you would like to change this behavior and always run the asynchronous one, you can pass an option here, which is async always, which is going to run the async validation even if the sync validation did not pass. However, I'm going to keep the default behavior where if this one failed, this one is not going to run. If this one did not fail, this one is going to run. And let's give it a try now by opening, let's open maybe our network request so that we can see our request being sent. So now I'm going to type something here. Now, since we have an error, this one did not run. However, if we do not have an error, now our network request is going to run, as you can see here. And since we are having this onChange, it's going to run every time we change our input. And this can be a problem every time we type something in our input, a network request is being sent. And this is probably not what you need. So I'm going to clear this. And we also have an option to debounce this onChange async function. So we can debounce our function in a couple of ways. First, in the field component, we can maybe pass this async debounce milliseconds. And let's say 500 milliseconds or so. And this is going to debounce any function that we have here, any async validation function, onChange async, onBlur async, and so on. However, we can be more specific, and instead of this option, inside of validators, we can pass debouncing options for each function. So we have onChange async debounce, we can also have onBlur async debounce, and so on. So let's use maybe this one, set it to 500 and save. And now let's maybe clear our network and let's give it a refresh. As we type here, no requests are being sent except if we stop typing for 500 milliseconds. So as you can see here, we only have one request. And then after our 2-second delay that we have here, we get our validation error. Your name must be John. Let's maybe try to type John here. We shouldn't get errors. If we type something after 2 seconds, we should get the error. Finally, we also have a flag in our field meta information. So let's maybe remember the information that we have here. Let's get it back. We have this flag here is validating, which is going to be true if we currently have an asynchronous validation running. So let's try to type something. As you can see, it is true. And when the request is done, it is going to be false. So you can maybe use this to maybe display some sort of a spinner when you have an async validation currently running. So in addition to onChange, onBlur, onChange async, onBlur async, onSubmit, and so on, we also have one option that we can have here, which is onDynamic. So onDynamic allows us to change when exactly the validation is going to run, however dynamically. So we don't have to make it always onChange or always onBlur. We can make it dynamic based on the state of the form. So for example, let's say we need to run our validations on submit initially before we submit the form for the first time. But if we submitted the form for the first time, now we need our validations to run on blur, for example, or on change or anything. So we need our function here to be somehow dynamic. So to do that, we have on dynamic as well. And of course also on dynamic async. So to keep things simple, let's maybe remove the async one. And let's also keep one validation, which checks for the length here. However, let's change it from onChange to onDynamic, like so. However, in order for onDynamic to work, we need to go back to our useForm hook here, and we need to pass an option, which is validation logic. And in here, we need to import a function called reValidateLogic that we can import from TanStack React Form, like so, reValidateLogic. And we just call it, like so. And what is going to happen now is, by default, when we use this reValidateLogic function, it is going to make this onDynamic behave like so. Our validation is going to run on submit initially. And then after our first submission, our validation is going to run on change. So let's maybe try to refresh this. Type something here that has an error. We don't get validations because our validations are going to run on submit. So let's submit. Now after submitting, we get our error. But then since we submitted our form for the first time, now our validation is going to happen on change. So as we type now, we're going to get our validation. We can customize this behavior by adding some options to this reValidateLogic function. So in here we can pass an object, we can pass a mode here, and this is going to be the initial mode. So let's maybe keep it as submit, which is the default. However, we also have this option mode after submission, which is going to be the mode after we submit our form for the first time. By default, it is on change. Let's maybe make it blur. Now let's refresh our form. Type something that has an error. Initially, we don't get validation. When we submit, we get our validation error. Now if we type, we are only going to get our validation once we blur. So I'm going to blur now. Now we get our validation like so. All right. So I hope this is clear. And also notice that in our error map, now we get onDynamic as well. So that if you need to know that this error came from onDynamic, you're also able to know from this error map as well. And by using onDynamic, it does not mean that you cannot use other validation functions as well in addition to onDynamic. So in here, you can normally have an onChange validation, onBlur validation, onSubmit validation, and so on, in addition to onDynamic. And as we mentioned, onDynamic have an async version as well, onDynamic async, that you can use. Sometimes our validation for some field can depend on another field. So for example, let's say we have, remember in our form we have password and confirm password. In order to validate the confirm password field, we depend on password. And also when we change our password, we need to update the validation for confirm password and so on. So first of all, we don't have these fields yet in our UI, so let's add them. I'm going to paste these fields quickly since we have already done something similar. So let's put them here maybe after this street field, that we have here. So we have our street. Let's maybe after our street, I'm going to paste a couple of fields like so. So we have our password field, which has an input of type password, and we pass everything similar to what we've done in the other fields, and the same for confirm password as well. So now if I save this, I'm going to have password and confirm password. In our confirm password, this might have an error if our passwords do not match. So I'm just going to copy the how we display the error here from another field, and also in our confirm password field, I'm going to display this error. Now in our confirm password field, let's add our validators, right? So in validators, I'm going to add an object, and let's do it on change, for example. Every time we type, we need to make sure the passwords are the same, the main password and the confirm password. So in here, we should get a function, and in the function, we have a couple of stuff. We have our value for the field, but remember, we also have the field API as well. The value is going to be the value for confirm password, and to get the value for the password so that we can compare them, we can use this field API. So in here, we can check if the value is not equals to, and then in field API, we can have access to the form, and in the form, we have access to a function called getFieldValue, where we can get the value of any field. In our case, we need to get the value for password. If they do not match, we need to return an error. Let's return passwords do not match. Otherwise, we just need to return undefined, which means we don't have any errors. And this should work. If we type maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 here and 1, 2 here, we get our error. However, if I type 1, 2, 3, 4, we should not get the error. However, now if I change the main password to maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now they do not match. However, we don't get the validation for confirm password. It is not going to run since we did not change the confirm password. However, we changed the password. However, we can make the validation for confirm password change when the main password changes by doing something here. In validators, we can pass on change, listen to, and then we can pass an array here, and we can listen to other fields when they change. In our case, we need to listen for password. So this means the onChange validation for confirm password is going to run when password changes as well. So if we save this, now if we type here, it's not working. Maybe I need to refresh or so. So let's type 1, 2, 3, 4, and maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, and then change this to 5. Now the validation for confirm password is running, even though we did not change confirm password itself, but we changed the main password. And of course, in addition to onChange listen to, we also have onBlur listen to as well. So as we've seen in TanStack Form, we have a lot of flexibility when it comes to validation. We can choose when exactly to validate, and we can also provide our own functions to perform our validation logic. However, as your forms grow, or if you have a large application with a lot of forms, providing your own functions here can be a little bit verbose, and you can find yourself writing a lot of code just for validation. So using a schema-based validation library can make this whole process a lot easier. TanStack Form supports multiple libraries like Zod and Valibot and more. However, we are going to use Zod in this video. So what we can do, instead of writing our own validation functions, we can just write a single schema and pass it to our entire form to validate all of our fields. We can also, if we would like, validate fields separately as well. So similar to what we can do with these functions, we can validate using Zod on the field level and also on the form level as well. So let's see how can we do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove any validation that we've done so far, so that we can just have a form without any validation, and we can do our validation from scratch using Zod. So we have validation here in validators in confirm password. Let's remove that completely. I think we also had it in the first name as well. So in the first name we had validators. Let's remove that. And I guess that was it. On the form level, we used to have validations, but we already removed validations on the form level. We only have validation logic here, which I'm going to keep because we're going to use it later as well. So right now we have a form without any validation, right? So let's now install Zod. So I'm going to go right here and just do npm install Zod. And now let's use it. So I'm going to import Zod in here, like so, import everything as Z from Zod. And we can define a schema for our entire form, or we can also validate fields separately using Zod. So we can go maybe here in our first name field, for example, and we can still have our validators like so, and we can still have our onChange, validate onChange, but this time instead of passing a function, we can pass Z dot, we need this to be a string, so Z dot string, and then we can say, let's have a minimum length of 2, for example, so we can pass min 2 like so, and we can also pass a message. So let's say first name should be at least 2 characters. We can also pass .max and so on. If you are familiar with Zod, you should be already familiar with this. So now, if we, let's say, type something that has an error, we're going to get an object here, because when we do validations with Zod, our validation error is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be a string. As you can see here, we have in our errors an array of objects, not an array of strings. And in each object, we have our message. So we have first name should be at least 2 characters here. So what we need to do is we just need to modify the markup where we display our error. So instead of displaying our errors like so, we need to loop through our errors array. So we can do a map here. And then for each error, we're going to have our error message. So we can maybe just return the error.message like so. So this is going to return an array of our messages, and we just need to join them in order to make them a string. So we can just join, and as a separator, let's do our comma like so. Now if we save this, we should have our error message like so. And of course, we can also do the same with onBlur and so on. So let's maybe add another one with onBlur. And let's say this time we need to do something that we cannot do with the Zod functions directly. So oh, sorry, not here, not in our listeners, in our validators. So in Zod, we have functions like min, max, and so on to check for things that are most commonly used. But let's say we need to validate, similar to what we've done at some point, to validate that our name is not equals to John. What we can do is, in this case, in Zod, we have this refine function that we can use. So we can do Zod or Z.string. So we need this to be a string. However, instead of minimum and maximum, we can pass refine here to check for something in our string. So in here, we can pass function. We're going to get our value. We can check maybe that our value is not equals to John. And if what we return from this function is false, then our field is going to be considered invalid, and we can return a message here. So we can pass an object with a message, or actually, sorry, an error. And we can say, let's say, first name cannot be John. So now if we are doing this on blur, so if we type John here and blur our field, we should get our error, first name cannot be John. Also in our error map, we still get everything. We get the error from unblur. However, this time it is an array of objects and not an array of strings. However, it is probably more convenient when we are using Zod. Instead of validating each field on the field level, we can define a schema for our entire form and validate on the form level instead. So I'm going to remove these. So this was just an example. Let's remove it for now. And let's do validation for our entire form by defining a single schema. So in here, of course, don't worry, we're going to clean things up later. We're just putting everything in one file for now. So in here, maybe after this interface, I'm going to define a schema. So let's call it form schema. And then in here, we need to define a schema for all of our fields. So it's going to be a Zod object containing all of our fields, which are first name, last name, and so on. So I'm going to paste this. It is very straightforward. So in here, I have a schema where I just define the validation rules for each field. First name should be a string, should have a minimum of 2, maximum of 50, and so on. And also we have an age should be a number, minimum, maximum, and so on. Accept terms should be a boolean. Email should be an email, so that.email is going to validate the email field to be a valid email address, and so on. If you are familiar with Zod, this should be very straightforward. If not, we can maybe do a video about Zod. Let me know if you'd like to do a dedicated video just for Zod. Anyways, we also have our address, which is a nested object. So we have another Zod.object, and then we have our street, city, state, and so on. And then our skills, which is zod.array, and in each array we have an object. In each array item we have an object which contains name, ID, and a level. And the level is an enum with beginner, intermediate, expert, and so on. But now that we have that, first of all, remember we have defined our default values and we've given it a type of register form, which is the interface that we defined here. However, now that we have this zod schema, we can maybe remove this completely. And using zod, we can infer our TypeScript type from our schema. So by defining this schema, we can somehow create or infer a TypeScript type from the schema instead of having to define our type like so. So when we give a type to our default values, instead of doing it like so, we can use z.infer, and we can infer the type of our schema by adding here in a generic type of, and then the name of our schema, which is form schema, like so. And now finally, in our form, when we define our form using useForm, we can pass our validators, and this time it's a schema and not a function. So we can pass here, let's say we need to do onChange, onChange, and we can do, we can pass our form schema like so. So great, let's give it a try. Let's also maybe just remove this object here so that we can see things clearly. Let's give it a refresh, let's type something. And as you can see, we have errors. As we type, we just need to modify the how we display the errors, similar to what we've done for this first field. So let's actually do it quickly. Let's copy this. Remember, we are mapping through an array of objects now, so we need to modify the rest of the fields. So let's copy this, and let's put it for all of our fields. So let's maybe do it for first name, and also don't worry, we're going to clean things up later. For now, we're just focusing on the concepts. So let's do it for first name. Let's do it for replace this for this field, which is address. For password as well, let's do it for password itself as well, because we have some validation rules for password. And let's do it for confirm password. We also had it in here for the skill level. So let's remove this old one, replace it with the new one. We also have the accept terms field. Let's also, if we don't accept the terms, we need to display an error. We already have a validation rule for that defined in our schema. We have an error message as well. So if we don't accept the terms, we need to display an error. So let's go to our accept terms field, which is here. And let's maybe after this label, display this error as well. All right. So now we should have our errors displayed for all of our fields. Up here, we remember before our form, we were displaying errors that are related to the entire form and not just a specific field. And these are also now an array of objects instead of an array of strings. So we need to modify that as well. But let's maybe just for now remove this completely. And I'm just going to display the JSON for our form errors. So if we save this, we're going to get an array of errors for all of our errors. However, we don't need that. What we're displaying here for now is enough. So I'm going to just comment this for now, right? The main problem here now is if we refresh, if we type something in first name, all of our fields are going to be validated. And this happens by default when we use zod, because we are passing our validation schema here that happens on change. So all of our fields are going to be validated against this schema whenever we change any field, right? So if we would like to not display an error if we did not change a field, we can just go. Let's just have an example in maybe this street, for example. So let's go to the street. When we display our error, we can check is valid, but we can also check if the field is touched, and only display the error if the field is touched. Or maybe we can use is dirty as well. So we can check here if field.state.meta.is, let's say is dirty, and save this. And now if we refresh, type something here, the error for street is not going to show up until we actually change something in street. And we can do that for all of our errors. However, I'm going to remove this for now because later we're going to clean things up and move how we display errors in a separate component and so on. So let's maybe just remove it for now. And later we're going to handle this, right? But then we also have this other problem, which is validating the password. So in our schema, we have a validation rule for our password. It should be at least 6 characters. However, for confirm password, we need to validate that, of course, confirm password is the same as password. We've seen how to do that if we are not using Zod. However, how can we handle this if we are using Zod? So for example, I can type here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't get an error here, but if I type something different here, I should get an error, but we're not handling this at the moment. So to do that in Zod, in our schema, so in this, after the closing of this object, which is here, we can add a refine function, refine, to check for custom things like this. So in here, we can pass a function, and we're going to get in this function the value for our entire form, our entire object. So let's call it data. And then in here, we can check data.password is equals to data.confirm password. So as we've mentioned before in this refine function, if we returned false from here, our field is going to be considered invalid. So if the passwords are not equal, this is going to return false, and we need to display an error message. And we also need to specify which field exactly to display the error message at, right? So in the second argument, we can pass our message in error. So let's say passwords do not match. And we need to display this error in the confirm password field. So we can add a path here and specify that we need to display this in confirm password. Of course, what we type here should match what we have here in our schema, right? And that's it. So if we save this now, let's maybe give it a refresh, type something here. And as you can see, we get passwords do not match in the confirm password field. Using refine, we can also do async validation if we are using Zod to do our validation. So let's go to maybe our first name field, and let's say we need to have an asynchronous validation for our first name field. So you can get back our validators in here. Let's say we need to do this on change. So let's add on change async debounce to debounce our function, and let's add on change async. And now that we are using Zod, instead of passing a function here, we can pass Z. We need to validate that this is a string. And then we need to refine this and do something asynchronous in this refine function. So refine can also accept an asynchronous function. So we can pass an asynchronous function here, where we are going to get our value as well. So we can do something with that, send a request and so on. I'm just going to simulate that we are doing something here and then return something. And if this something is false, our field is invalid. So let's say if our name is not John. And of course, the second argument to refine can be our message, which we can add here in error. So let's add some message here. First name cannot be John. And let's say this is coming from our async validation function here. So now let's give it a refresh. Let's try to type something here that is not John. And we don't get an error. However, if we type John, after a second, we should get our error here. Let's finally try one final thing. So before using Zod, we had this onDynamic, where when we define our form here, we pass validation logic, and we specify that we need our validation to run on submit, but then after the first submission, we need our validation to run on blur. We can use onDynamic with Zod as well. Just in here, when we specify our validators, we can use onDynamic and pass our schema. And now if we refresh, our validations are going to only run on submit for the first time. So after submitting the form, but then after that, it's going to run on blur, as you can see here. Let's talk a bit about submitting our form before cleaning things up in our form. So we have already seen that in our form, when we use the useForm hook, we have this onSubmit, and we can do something when we submit our form with our values. Let's open our console here and let's try to submit our form. By having a valid form here, I'm going to just type things here Let's also remove this annoying log from here. So I'm going to accept terms, and I think we should now be able to submit. So sorry, I realized we cannot submit our form because in our schema we have validation rules for our email. In here we have our email should be an email. We also have our city, state, and so on, and we don't actually have these fields here yet. So that's why we are getting validation errors, even though we cannot see them. So sorry for that, but for now I'm just going to maybe not pass the email and not pass these things except the street, which we have a field for. And in our schema, I guess we have, yes, we have the email as optional. So now we should not get an error if we don't pass the email. And also these things, city, state, and so on, are optional as well. So now we should be able to submit our form. So I'm going to just type anything for now. And now if I submit, we should, oh sorry, it looks like I have an error. Now if I submit, we should have our stuff in our console, which are the values of the form. However, a very important thing to notice here is, if you are familiar with Zod, you know that the input for Zod can be different than the output. So when we have some sort of an object that we need to validate, and we use Zod to validate it, after validating the object, Zod can actually produce a different output. However, what we get here is the input and not the output. So just to show you an example, when we define a Zod schema, we can have things that can transform the input into something different. So for example, you have this coerce function that can coerce a string to a number and so on. We have transforms as well. So maybe in here after our schema, we can have a transform. We can do something to transform our input when we validate our schema. So let's have a quick example here. In transform, we get our data as well in a function, and we can do something that is going to transform our data. So in here, I'm going to maybe return another object that contains, let's say, all of our data. However, for our skills, let's say we need to just, instead of having the array of objects, let's say we need to have an array of IDs for our skills. So we can get our data.skills and then map. And for each skill, we can just return the ID. So by doing this and submitting our form again, in our skills, as you can see, we still get the array of objects because this is the input. If we need to have the output of Zod, we need to do it ourselves. So in our onSubmit function, we're getting some errors here because of the transformation that we've done, but we're going to remove it in a moment. In our onSubmit function, we need to parse our input using Zod ourselves. So we can use form schema.parse and then pass our value here. And this way, sorry, console log, and this way we are going to get the output of Zod. So if we save now, submit, we get the input, which contains the array of objects for the skills, and the output of Zod, which contains now the array of IDs. So just keep this in mind when you are using Zod and you get the value here on submit, the value is the input and not the output of Zod. But let's now remove this transform because it is causing some errors. And we also have an error somewhere here. Yeah, from the listeners, we're not using this. So let's actually remove it as well. Another thing that I would like to mention when submitting is that we can pass some metadata when we submit our form. So in here, remember, when we submit our form, we call form.handleSubmit. When we call form.handleSubmit, we can pass any arbitrary object here. We can pass some metadata. So let's just do key and value for now. And when we submit our form, we're going to get whatever we pass here in our onSubmit function. So in here, we get meta as well. So let's maybe console log this and save. And now if we submit, we should get our key value here. This can be useful. For example, let's say when you submit your form, you can submit it with multiple buttons. So maybe you can have this submit button here. Let's say this one saves the form, for example. And let's say you have another one. So let's actually wrap everything with a div here. And let's say you have another button that should save and maybe go back. So save and go back. And based on which button you clicked, you need to know this information, you need to know which button was clicked in your submit function, in your submit callback, so that you can take an action after submitting your form. So we can maybe add an onClick handler here. And onClick, we can from here call form.handleSubmit instead of calling form.handleSubmit in the form itself when we submit our form. And in here we can pass our data. So let's say maybe submit action, and let's say save, and let's do the same. And this one should be maybe go back or something. Now by having this, if we click on save, we are going to get submit action save. If we click on save and go back, we should get submit action go back. So now that we are familiar with TanStack Form APIs, let's now see how we would actually use TanStack Form in production. So normally in production, you might be using something like a components library, or you might have your own components. However, you are probably not going to use just a normal input tag here and style it every time you need to use it and so on. You probably have a component that you're using, or you're using some components library. In our case, we are having shadcn installed. So let's try and integrate shadcn with TanStack Form and use the field component that we get in shadcn. So in shadcn, we have this field component where we can have a field, and it can be just a text input, a drop down, it can be a checkbox, it can be anything. And in addition to that, we also have components for validation errors, for example. So if we scroll down here, somewhere here, we should find this field error component, for example, that we can use to display errors instead of the stuff that we are doing here at the moment. So let's now try to use this field component. So what we need to do first is we need to add the shadcn components that we need to our project. So I'm going to go here in my terminal. I'm going to run this. So npx shadcn latest and then add, and then I'm going to add the field component, the input, select, checkbox, and the button component as well. Now if I run this, we should in our project have these components in our folder. So after this is done, if we go back here, we should find the components folder with all the components that we have installed. And now let's try to use it for maybe our first name first. So in here we have the field for our first name. Now when we render our children, let's maybe remove all of that. And now let's use our shadcn component. So in here I'm going to import the field from our UI components UI folder, the field component. And then to add a label, we use the field label component. And then let's add first name. And in here, let's add HTML4, let's say first name as well. And I guess I did not import the field. Let's import it. And now after our field, we need to import our input from our components folder. And in our input, we're going to need to, similar to what we've done with the HTML input, pass our stuff. So we need to have an ID here of first name. And just to save some time, this is going to be very straightforward. So I'm going to paste the stuff that we need. Just add a type of text, a placeholder. And also we need to pass the value from our field that we get here in our function, onBlur and onChange, similar to what we've done with the HTML input. However, in shadcn, we also have a description component, field description that we can use. So maybe in here, you can add some description. And finally, we need to display our errors. So remember, how we display our errors is that we check if our field is not valid, we display this div. Let's actually copy that again and put it here after our description. However, now, instead of using this div, let's actually use a component from shadcn, which is field error, this one. And let's close it like so, and just put the error inside of this component. Now, if we save this, as you can see, we get our component here. And if we have errors, it should display like so. We also need to wrap everything with a field group component. This is going to help in styling. So maybe before, after, inside of our form and before our fields, wrap all of our field with a field group component that is actually also installed in shadcn. So let's close this in here like so. So now we have some spacing after our field. And now we can just simply do the same for the rest of our fields. I'm going to do it and walk you through it quickly because it is kind of pointless to do it on screen. So now I have changed all of our components to the shadcn ones. So the first name, we've already done it. The last name, is actually also a text input, so it is just exactly similar. So let's maybe close that. And for the street, this is also a text field, exactly similar. For the password, also a text field. The only difference is maybe just the type of password here. And same for confirm password as well. For this array of skills, I have just used some components here from shadcn as well. Field set, field legend, and then another field group wrapping everything in our loop. And then I'll just display a field. But now in this case, we have a dropdown and not a text input. So I just used this select component from shadcn. However, something that might be different from one component library to the other is maybe these events. So for this select component, for example, we pass it the value here. We also pass it on value change when the value changes. So we need to call handle change in this callback. However, onBlur in this component is passed to this select trigger and not to the select. So maybe this is just something that you have to be aware of depending on which components library you are using. And then we have this select content where we put our options for the dropdown. So we have our beginner, intermediate, expert, like so. And of course, I also used the button component from shadcn. So now we are using the button component from shadcn and not the normal HTML button. And finally, we also have this accept terms field where I used this checkbox component from shadcn. And I passed our stuff. So maybe for a checkbox, the value is going to be in this checked component. So we need to pass our value from our field state to the checked prop. And also when the value changes, this is going to be handled by this onChecked change. So we need to call handle change in this callback. And the onBlur is simply onBlur. And this is mainly it. For also the submit buttons, I just removed the HTML buttons with the styling that we were using and just used the button component from shadcn as well. So I'm going to put you the code for this if you'd like to take a look as well. So now by using the shadcn components, we might have a nicer looking UI. However, we still have the problem of the amount of code that we had to write in order to create this simple form. So as you can see here, this file is almost 500 or 400 lines of code. And if you have an application with a lot of forms or large forms, this is going to be a pain to write. Every time you will have to render your components, you will have to pass these callbacks like so, you will have to render the errors like so and so on. And of course, this does not make sense. However, fortunately, TanStack Form provides us with a way to make our forms a lot smaller. So let's see how, but first let's maybe clean things up a little bit. For example, we were logging this values object here. Let's maybe remove this. And then up here, we were defining our schema and default values. These can obviously live in a separate file as well. So let's do that. So in here, I'm going to maybe create a folder and put different files inside of it. So inside of this slave folder, for example, let's create another folder. Maybe let's call it register form or whatever this form should be. And inside of here, let's create a file for shared things. So in here, I'm going to create a file called shared.ts. And let's in here move our stuff that is going to be shared by different files in this register form component, register form folder. So for example, the form schema, the default values, and the form options. Let's copy or cut these from here. And let's just put them here and export. Of course, we need to import Zod. We also need to import form options as well. Let's also maybe call it something more clear, register form options, and let's export it. Let's also export our schema and our default values like so. And now let's go back to our register form component and let's import these things. So in here, let's import register form options. In here, let's import form schema. I guess we might also call it register form schema and update this as well, just to be more clear with what this is. So in here, let's import register form schema and put it here as well. And I guess if we save this, everything should work. So if we refresh, let's try to submit, and everything is working, our validation is working, and so on. We can also remove imports that we're not using now. These things we're not using anymore, and I guess it's fine for now. Let's also move this component maybe in this folder as well, so that we have everything living in this register form folder. However, by doing that, we will need to go to the app.tsx and make sure that now your import is updated to this path now. So let's refresh, everything should still be working. So that was a bit of an organization, but now let's focus on our main problem. What we need to do now is every time we need to create a form and render our field, we need to figure out a way to avoid having to write all of that boilerplate just to display the input and display the errors for the input and so on. So what we can do is, instead of using the useForm hook provided by TanStack Form, we can create a custom hook, and this custom hook is already going to have our components, our input components predefined, and everything that we do here, so when we pass our value, our own blur, and our own change and so on, all of that is going to be predefined by this custom hook, and we can just use our input component without having to pass all of that stuff. So let's see how can we do that. So in our folder, I'm going to create maybe, let's in our source folder, create a new folder. Let's call it hooks. And let's create this custom hook, which is pretty simple. We won't actually have to do a lot of stuff ourselves. TanStack Form provides us with a simple way to do that. So we create a new folder here. Let's call it maybe form context.tsx. And from here, we're going to need to export some stuff from a function that we can import from TanStack Form, which is create form, this one, hook contexts, right? So this function is going to return some stuff that we can destructure from here, including field context, form context, and also use field context and use form context. And we need to export all of that so that we can use it in another file. So let's export all of that. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to define components for our forms. And when we define components for our forms, as you can see here, in our component, we need to have access to the field, right? In order to display the field value, in order to pass on blur, on change, and so on, we need to have access to the field. But now that we're going to define these components in separate files, as we're going to see now, in order to have access to this field, we're going to do that using this context provided here. So field context and use field context are going to provide us access to our fields when we create components for our inputs. So if you're confused, we're going to see everything now. So let's now, after creating this folder and exporting our stuff, in our hooks folder, let's create another file. Let's call it form.tsx. In here, we need to define our custom hook that, as we mentioned, we're going to use instead of this useForm hook, right? So in here, we need to call a function called create form hook, like so. And then we need to pass it some stuff, and then it's also going to return some stuff. So what do we need to pass it? We need to pass it the contexts that we exported in the other file, so the field context. So field context equals to field context from the file that we just created, and also form context as well. And we can pass an object of field components. Let's set it to an empty object for now. And also we can have form components, right? So in here, we're going to pass different components that we're going to need to use in our forms. So in field components, we can pass our inputs, our checkboxes, and so on. And in form components, we can have things like submit buttons, things related to the form itself, not a specific field. We're going to also have an example. And then this function is going to return our custom hook that we can use, which is called useAppForm. It is also going to return withForm and withFieldGroup, which are functions that can also help us maybe organize our form a little bit. We're going to take a look at these later, but for now, let's focus on useAppForm. Let's also export all of that from this file. And now in our register form, instead of using useForm, let's use the useAppForm from our hooks folder, like so. So by doing this, obviously nothing is going to change for now. But now what we can do is in here, when we call create form hook, we can define these components that we are using here in our form. So maybe the input component, the checkbox component, and so on. Define these in separate files and then pass them to this function in the field components. And by doing so, using this useAppForm hook, we won't have to write all of that every time. These components are going to be predefined by this hook, and we can just use them in a much simpler way than that. And when we define these components, we're going to have access to our field, since we are in here already passing our field context, and in here we are exporting this useFieldContext function. So using this function, we're going to have access to our field when we define our component. So let's now see how can we define our custom components. So let's maybe define a component for our text field, and for the other fields, I am maybe also going to do them and walk you through them quickly, but let's do the text field or text input. So in here, let's go into our, let's say in our components folder, let's maybe create another folder. So this UI one is the shadcn components. Let's create another one for our own components. Let's call it maybe form. Inside of form, let's create a component for our text input. So let's call it text input.tsx. Now in here, let's just define a React component. And what we need to do is we need to copy the stuff that we do in our form in order to display the input. So let's copy all of that from here. And let's actually cut it as well. So I'm going to cut this from here and just simply put it here like so. And we need to also import our stuff. Let's maybe copy these from here. Import our stuff like so. We don't need all of that, so let's remove unused imports. And let's also import our input. And let's save. And now we're going to have this problem where we need to have access to the field. In here, when we created the form, we have access to this field in this function, right? But now, as we've mentioned, we're going to have access to it using the context. So in here in form context.tsx, remember we were exporting a field context and use field context, and we are passing this field context to the function that creates useAppForm here or here. So when we use useAppForm now in our form, which we are doing, useAppForm, when we create a component for a field, this field is going to have the field context provided. So we can just simply use the useFieldContext function in order to have access to the field. So in here we can use, we can call useFieldContext. Just make sure this is the useFieldContext that you exported from this form context file here, right? And we just need to give it a type. So this is a text input, so our field is going to be a string. And by doing so, I guess we should not have any errors. What we need to do though is we have some hard-coded stuff here. So the label, the description, the placeholder, and so on. So what we need to do is we need to be able to change these when we use our components. We can just pass these as props. So let's define our props here. Let's say label, description, and also remember we have this ID that we pass here and here. We need to make this a prop as well. Let's also give it a type. So label is going to be a string, ID a string, description, let's make it optional string as well. Now we can simply remove this, replace it with label. Let's also make the placeholder the same as the label. You can make a specific prop for it, but let's keep it simple. And for this and this, we need to pass the ID. And in here, we need to pass our description, like so. Sorry, description. And in here, we are just rendering the errors. I guess we will not have to change anything here. And now by having this component, we can go in our form.tsx and pass it here in our field components so that we can have access to it in our form and just use it instead of having to do all of the boilerplate for each field. So in here, we can pass a component. You can call it anything. I'm going to call it text input and pass it our text input component that we just created, which is make sure to import the right one, which is inside of the forms folder, or sorry, the form folder that we created inside of components, like so. And now finally, we can go back to our form, and remember, we removed the stuff that we were returning for first name. And now we can simply return field. And then inside of field, we're going to have access to the text input component that we passed in here when we defined our hook. However, we have to modify something a little bit. So now instead of using form.field, we need to use form.appField. Why? Because this is going to provide the context needed for our text input component, the context that we are using here. So we need to change this from form.field to form.appField and then close it like so. And now we're going to have access to our components. In our case, we have our text input, where we just need to pass it the ID, let's say first name, the label, and we also have an optional description as well. By the way, I think we need to, in here, we need to check that we have a description before displaying the field description component. So now if we save this, we get our first name. However, as you can see, this is now a lot smaller than what we had before. We don't have to pass any values, any callbacks, just this simple field component. If we would like, we can also pass a description and it should show up like so. And now we can simply do the same for the rest of our fields. So let's maybe do it for the last name as well. So remember, if we have a first name, we have this last name field. So in here, as you can see, this is the amount of code that we can remove now. So let's remove this and simply, let's remove from here, from field to here, like so, and simply change this to app field. And in here, just simply use field.text input and pass our stuff. So our ID, a label, and optionally a description as well. So great. As you can see, our forms can be a lot smaller in size now if we do the same thing for the rest of our fields. I'm also going to, remember we had some stuff that we were testing with here. So these validators, for example, let's just, instead of having a lot of noise here, remove these and the listeners as well from here, like so. And also, remember we were having form.subscribe here in order to only show the last name if we have a first name. This was just an example also, so let's maybe remove it, remove this, and only keep our form, like so, our field, sorry. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same for the rest of our fields. So I'm going to create a component for the dropdown, a component for the checkbox, and so on, and also use them here and walk you through the result. I'm not going to do this on screen because I guess it will just be pointless. It is going to be the same process, just creating components and using them here. So now after I am done with creating components for our inputs and updating our form and using these components, as you can see, our file, our register form is now almost half in size, and we can even do better. We're going to see later, but for now, this is much better. So what I have done is I went into our components folder. In here, in the form folder, I created a component for checkbox and for select as well, and also for text input. I have just modified it a little bit so that it accepts a type as well. By default, it is text, but we can override the type so that we can use it for the password field as well. But then I created a checkbox component in a similar way. Of course, I'm going to put you the code for this. And I just realized this. I have no idea how this happened. However, let's fix it quickly. We also need to pass maybe an ID here for our component and then give ID to our checkbox, and in HTML4 here pass the ID like so. Sorry for that, but anyway, the same concept. We create our checkbox, we pass it our stuff, we have access to the field using a useField context, and we also display our errors. And this should be called checkbox. Looks like I was in a hurry when I created these. And let's also call it something else because we are already importing the checkbox from shadcn. But anyways, now also the select component, As well, I've done it in the same way, just using the shadcn components and passing the props that we need and displaying the errors and so on. And then in our form, we need to pass these components to create form hook so that when we use useAppForm, we're going to have access to these. And by doing so, in our form, I have used these components for all of our fields. So let's go through these quickly. We have our first name, now it is much smaller, our last name, our address as well. Just don't forget that you need to wrap your components with form.appField instead of form.field. For the password as well, same thing, just pass the type of password here, confirm password. And then for the skills array, I have changed the styling a little bit, but it is pretty much the same, but now I'm using the, of course, don't forget the form.appField here, and also I use the select component that I defined here as well. Finally, for our checkbox, as you can see, much smaller, just need to pass the ID that we just fixed. So let's say accept terms. And in here, form.subscribe and the buttons, I have not done anything here. So it should work exactly the same. If we submit, we should get our validation and everything. But now our form is a lot smaller in size and a lot easier to use as well. We can still do better though. So in addition to, let's maybe close these. In addition to field components that we have here, we also have form components as well. In here, we can pass components related to the form itself, not a field component, like for example, these submit buttons. So in here, these submit buttons, we are using form.subscribe and then we are rendering our buttons and so on. Instead of having to do all of that here, we can also abstract this into a separate component and use it here, similar to what we are doing with the fields. And we can do that by going into our create form hook, create a component for the submit buttons and pass it here. So let's do that. So in my form folder here, I'm going to create a new file, new component. Let's call it submit button.tsx. And in here, let's create a new React component. And let's just go to our form and let's copy the stuff related to the submit button, starting from form.subscribe here. Like so, let's copy this or cut it from here. And let's just put it here. Now we need to, of course, import some stuff and so on. So let's import the button from our UI. I guess that's actually it. But now we need to have access to the form. Similar to the field context, remember we also have the form context as well that we are getting from here and we are passing here. So we're going to have access to our form using the form context as well. And we can access it using the useForm context function. So in here, we can do constant form and just use form context. Oh, sorry. Use form context like so. And this should work. Of course, in this component, we can have maybe props to customize things that need to be customized here. Maybe the data that we are sending when we submit, maybe the text and stuff like that. However, I'm just going to keep it simple. And now that we have this component, I'm going to pass it here. Give it a name, submit button, for example, and pass it the component that we just defined, which is submit button, like so. By doing so, we can go back here in our form, and in the form that we get from useAppForm, we should have access to this component. However, in order to use this component, we need to provide it with the context it needs in order to access the form. And to do that, we need to wrap our entire form with form.appForm. So let's wrap everything with form.appForm. This is going to ensure that the context needed for the form components is going to be available. Similar to when we used the field form.appField here in order to have context available in our components as well. But now that we're doing this, let's go here after or before closing our form and just simply use form.submit button like so. By doing this, if we save now, we should have our buttons back. and they should work exactly the same. Let's refresh. Let's submit. Everything is working exactly the same, but our form is now even much smaller in size. What we've done so far is great. However, in some cases, you might have a lot of form and field components that you define here in form.tsx. And in this case, if you import your components like so, they are going to be included in your bundle, in your JavaScript bundle, even if you are not using all of them in all of your forms. So what we can do is we can lazily import these components so that they will not be included in our JavaScript bundle. However, they're only going to be loaded when they are actually needed in a specific form that we are trying to view. So this can be simply done by, instead of importing like so, we can just import lazy from React. So import lazy from React, and then we can simply lazily import our components like so. So the same thing, text input, select, checkbox, submit button. However, we import using lazy, and we can pass them the same way. And when we do so, we'll just have to wrap our form component with suspense. So remember, in our app.tsx, this is where we are displaying our register form. Since in here we have things that are lazily loaded, we need to wrap it in suspense so that we can have a loading fallback while our components are loaded. So we can import suspense from React, wrap our form with it, and then we can provide a fallback. You can do anything. I'm just going to, for now, put a p tag with loading like so. Now if we refresh, we might find this maybe less than a second of loading until our components are loaded, and then our form is displayed. We've managed to make our form a lot smaller and more manageable. However, we can still do better. TanStack Form provides us with a way to break our form into smaller pieces. So remember when we defined our, here in form.tsx, when we created our hooks using create form hook, we got our useAppForm, which we have used, but we also got this withForm function here, which is a higher order component. So if you're not familiar, a higher order component in React is a component that you can wrap another component with, and it's going to provide the component being wrapped with additional props. We can use this to create subsections of our form, so move some sections in our form into separate components, wrap these components with withForm, and by doing so, instead of these subcomponents or subsections, we're going to have access to our form as well. So let's see how can we do that. So for example, in our form, this skills part is taking a lot of space. This skills field here, where we are looping through our skills and then displaying this as a drop down in order to change the skill and so on. It is taking a lot of space. We can move this maybe into a separate file and then import this file here. So let's see how can we do that using the withForm higher order component. So let's in here, in our register form folder, let's create a new component for our skills part. Let's call it register skills maybe or so. Now in here, we're going to export a new component. However, this component that we're going to export is going to be wrapped with useForm. So let's export a new component. Let's say register skills. And in here, we are going to import withForm from our hooks folder and then define our component here like so. What we need to do is we need to first of all pass our form options. So remember, in our folder, we created this shared folder that contains our form options that we are exporting from here. We're going to need to pass these into our withForm higher order component as well. So what we can do is we can just spread everything in our register form options like so. And then we pass a render function in order to render our component. And in this render function, we're going to have access to our form in here. And by having access to our form, we're going to be able to display our fields and so on. So in here, let's return. And what we need to return is just simply, sorry, this should be imported normally, not as a type. What we need to return here is, let's go back to our form, and we need to copy this part, this skills field. Let's cut it from here, and let's just paste it here like so. And now we have access to our form here, so we don't have a problem accessing form.app field. And also, since we are passing our form options here, we're going to get our type safety. We have our stuff defined here, our default values and so on. However, we just need to import these components. So we need field set, field legend, we need our description and our field group and also our button, and that should be it. So we have our component here, and now we can just simply use it in here. So how to do that is just import our component. However, we also need to pass it our form. So let's in here import our register skills, and we just need to pass it our form like so. Our form is of course what we get here from useAppForm. By doing so, let's now save, let's refresh. Everything should still be working exactly the same. However, now we just have a cleaner file here, and we have divided our form into smaller parts, and we can do that with other stuff as well. So remember, for example, in our form, we did not put the fields for these, but in our address, for example, we can have in addition to, in here, we can have in addition to street, we have city, state, zip code, and so on. We can maybe put all of these fields in a separate component and then import it in our form, so that we can just have a better organization for our form. Using withForm, we were able to split our form into smaller parts. However, these smaller parts that we created must be a child of our main form. So when we created register skills here, register skills can only be used as a child to our main form that we define here. So notice that we pass the same options, register form options, when we use useAppForm and also when we use withForm, like so. So these two components are tied together. Register skills must be used within the same form that we defined here. And this is fine, maybe this is what you need. However, sometimes you might need to do something similar. However, instead of creating a component that is tied to one form, like this register skills component, maybe you would like to create some reusable group of fields that can be used in any form, not just in a specific form. For example, we have here password and confirm password, for example. So maybe these two fields are going to be used here in a register form, maybe also in a change password form and so on. So you need to be able to, instead of having to create these fields for multiple forms, just have these defined once somehow, and then be able to reuse these fields in multiple forms. We can do that with this other export that we have here in form.tsx, which is withFieldGroup. So let's see how can we use it, and let's, as an example, try to move password and confirm password into a separate component that can be used in multiple forms. So let's do that by moving these fields into a separate component. So as I mentioned, what we're going to do now is we're going to create a component containing password and confirm password, and this component can be used within any form. So it is not tied to register form. So maybe instead of creating this component inside of register form, we can maybe put it in some shared folder, maybe in components, or actually let's put it inside of components and then form in here. Let's create a new file. Let's call it maybe password fields.tsx. And let's in here see how are we going to create this component. So in here, let's export a new component. Let's call it password fields. And this component is going to be wrapped inside of the withFieldGroup higher order component that we can import from our hooks. And in here, similar to withForm, we need to pass it default values. However, unlike withForm that we have used here in register skills, we're not going to pass it the same options of our register form because this is now not tied to any specific form. So what we can do is we can just pass it default values like so. And in here, I'm going to define some types and the default values for our password and confirm password. So our type is going to contain our password string, confirm password string, and our default values are just going to be password and confirm password with empty strings here. And this is what we are going to pass here as default values for these groups of fields. But now, sorry, let's remove this as well. But now we can also pass our render component similar to withForm. In here, we need to pass a function like so, function, and a function called render. And then in here, we're going to have access to a group, right? I'm going to return maybe a fragment because I don't want to wrap my fields in any div. And in here, we can use this group that we get here to define our fields. So inside of group, we're going to get our app field, app form field, and so on. So notice that this time we don't get a form here because these fields are not tied to a specific form. However, we get this group, and now we can go into our form and we can copy our password and confirm password fields. So let's copy these like so, cut these from here. And I'm going to go to my password fields component and I'm going to paste these. However, now we're not going to use form, we're going to use group instead, like so. Alright. By having that, we can use this component in any form and it is just going to add these fields to whatever form we are using this component in. And we can also, let's say inside of a group, we need to have access to things like maybe things that are related to the form. So maybe we need to subscribe to form.canSubmit, for example. We can do that. In this group, we're going to have access to the form. So we have group.form. And this form is going to be whatever form we are using our component in. So if we need to subscribe to canSubmit, for example, we're going to normally use the useStore hook. And to get our store, now we use group.form.store. And then we're going to get our state and we can subscribe to things related to the form that we are using this component in. But now let's try to use this component in our register form by going in here, and then let's in here import our password fields component, and we need to pass it some stuff. So we need to pass it the form itself like so, and we also need to pass it a prop fields. So let's say in our form, our register form, remember we have our default values and so on in here in this shared file. In our schema, our password fields look like so. We have password and we have confirm password. However, it could have also been something like this. So maybe we had passwords data, and then nested inside of it, we have our password and confirm password like so. Right? So we need to specify where exactly in our schema our password fields are stored. So remember, in our password fields component, we have a couple of fields, password and confirm password. We need to somehow map these fields that we have here in this subcomponent, map them to the place where they exist in our main component. So if they exist like so, inside of maybe passwords data field, then we need to pass here in this fields prop passwords data. By doing so, whatever we type in our password fields is going to be put in passwords data.password and passwords data.confirm password. However, this is not the case for us. In our schema, let's remove what we've done here. In our schema, we don't have our password and confirm password nested in another key. However, they are separate keys in our schema. So what we can do is we can map also which field in our schema corresponds to which field in our password fields component. In our case, they are the same. Password maps to password, confirm password maps to confirm password. However, they can have different names, so we can map them to different names as well. But in our case, they don't have different names, so what we can do is we can pass an object here, like so, and then specify that our password field maps to password in our schema. So password in the password fields component maps to password in our schema, and then confirm password in our password fields component maps to confirm password in our schema like so. However, if these have different names, if the fields in password fields maybe had different names, then we are just going to specify that in this map here. However, by having that, this should work. And if we maybe type something here, just to confirm that this is working, let's open our console as well. Remember, we are logging our values when we submit our form. So let's submit. Oh, and sorry, we have to have a valid form. So let's just type anything here, and this should be at least 6 characters. Let's accept, and now let's submit. And in here we should get our password populated, and also confirm password, which means this is working properly, and we are using our subcomponent here in order to populate some fields in our main form. But now this can not only be used in this form, it can be used in any form, and you can just map fields like so, depending on how your form looks like. But one final thing, if you noticed, our validation worked here. Let's maybe refresh. Our validation worked for our password and confirm password. So I'm going to type maybe passwords that are not matching and submit. And as you can see, the validation is working. Why? Because here in our main schema for this form, we are doing this validation. So in here, in our schema, in this shared folder, we are doing the validation for the password here using refine. However, this way, every time we use these fields, we're going to have to do the validation for every form, because our validation lives in the form level and not in this group of fields that we have defined. So what we can do is we can remove this from here. So I'm going to, maybe let's just comment it for now. And also, I'm going to remove the password fields from here as well. So remove password and remove confirm password. So we don't have these fields in our schema, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into our shared password fields component here. And instead of defining the type like so, I'm going to define a schema like so that contains, we need also to import z from Zod. So now in here I defined a schema that contains my password field and the confirm password field with all the validation that we need. And also I had the refine here instead. And this way we can have our validation for password and confirm password defined only once in this group. But then I just need to modify this. Now that we have removed our password fields type, let's infer our type from our schema. So infer like so, and then type of, and then our schema, which we called password schema, like so. And now what we need to do, if you notice here, I'm exporting this schema. And what we need to do in every form that we need to use password and confirm password, when we define our schema for this form, so for example here, we need to use, in our shared folder, we need to use our schema, our stuff in our schema, first name, last name, and so on, in addition to password and confirm password. However, instead of defining these here and defining the validation for these here, we can just extend the schema that we defined in our password fields here. And to do that, using Zod, we can, after defining our schema, call .end, and then import the passwords schema like so. So doing so, it's as if we are having our password confirm password field and our refine as well, but we are just defining these here separately so that we can reuse it in multiple forms. And by having this, if we refresh as well and type a password, we should have our validation still working as well. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to leave a like, leave maybe a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more content. And see you in the next one.